Welcome to Opening Up, Demystifying Funder Transparency. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tiffany Gottlieb. I'm the Regional Director of Programs here at Philanthropy Ohio. I'll be acting as a chairperson for the webinar, supporting logistics behind the scenes. Before we begin, I'm going to walk you through some functions of this webinar. All phone lines are muted during the webinar to eliminate background noise. To ask a question, use the chat box on the bottom left hand of your screen. Only the chair and the presenters can see your questions. If the chat box isn't open, you can click the top left hand of your screen. It should say chat. This will open the chat box function if it is closed or at any time. Thanks to Jessica and our marketing and department here at Philanthropy Ohio. We will be live tweeting during the webinar. Please via social media. If you'd like to make the slides bigger, you can maximize your screen by going to the top right-hand corner and clicking full screen. This webinar is being recorded, so if you arrive late, leave early, or miss any part, you can watch what you missed at your convenience. All recordings are placed on the member side of the Philanthropy Ohio website. They will also be posted on the GrantCraft website as well. If you experience any technical difficulties during the call, please dial back at the number we provided. Contact the ReadyTalk help desk, or go to readytalk.com and chat with the representative live. Now I'm going to turn the webinar over to Jen Bokoff, Director at GrantCraft, to introduce today's topic and guest speakers.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany, and thanks to the rest of the team at Philanthropy Ohio for inviting me to join you all today. Today's actually a very exciting day for GrantCraft because we are officially launching our new website. So this is a really exciting piece of that day. So again, thank you for inviting us to be here. What we're going to focus on today is talking about transparency. We came out with this guide, Opening Up Demystifying Funder Transparency, back in February. And the idea was that we'd host several webinars about the 5 different chapters in the guide. And we've already done one on sharing, and we'll cover the other couple chapters in the coming months. Let me tell you a little bit about how and why we developed the guide and what some of the topics are. Sorry, there was a little background noise on this end. So GrantCraft is a free resource that taps the practical wisdom of funders from around the world to develop resources that improve the practice of philanthropy. And we work closely alongside of Glass Pockets, which is the Foundation Center's website that champions philanthropic transparency in the online world. Glass Pockets provides the data, resources, examples, and action steps to foundations to help them to be more transparent. Our research for authoring the guide began with a survey that was sent to our GrantCraft email list of philanthropy professionals around the world, which includes probably a few folks on this webinar. And more than 750 people responded to the survey. The results, of course, are posted on our website in full. We then used the survey results and other recommendations to select 25 funders to interview. The funders represented a cross-section of foundations, large and small, private and community, and based in both cities and more rural areas from several countries. The interviews then landed us in the 5 major buckets, which became the 5 chapters that I explained that we're doing all the webinars on. So sharing grantee selection processes and grants data, which for many foundations is an important first step to take. So that's going from sometimes not having a website to having a website that just says we don't accept unsolicited proposals, and that already is a step toward transparency for many foundations. The second chapter is the needle moving? Sharing performance assessments. So why it's important to be transparent about the value of the programs that you're providing and sort of their strengths and areas of improvement. Third is improving relationships, strengthening engagement with grantees and other nonprofits. And this one we already have a recording on that you can view on the GrantCraft website. And that one featured Mary Gregory from the Bella Vista Foundation out in California. The next chapter is Peers Helping Peers, Improving the Practice of Philanthropy. So this is really about how transparency can strengthen the overall sector and therefore improve grant making by making it more strategic and more connected to those around them. And then finally, the one that we'll be talking about today is how we can communicate using every opportunity. Now, of course, there's some overlapping examples, and throughout the guide, our points of discovery were cross-cutting. But these chapters can be read either as an ensemble or independently to create more manageable, focused conversations about transparency within your foundation. So in that vein, today we're joined by a couple wonderful representatives of the Raymond John Wean Foundation, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, let's define transparency. So in the guide, we have a couple of very cute illustrations done by Sophie Lang, who's out in Brussels. She's been our GrantCraft illustrator for the last several years, and she helped us come up with this graphic. The definition that we gave transparency is, in a word, openness. A foundation that operates transparently is one that shares what it does, how it does it, and the difference that it makes in a frank, easily accessible, and timely way. So before we talk about our main topic of the day, which is how to communicate transparently, I wanted to get a read of the room. So we have a number of people on this webinar. All of you are funders. And so I thought we'd start with 2 litmus tests of who's in the room. So you should see a poll popping up on your screen. And the question is, on a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being the most and 1 being the least, how comfortable is your foundation with the idea of transparency? And I have foundation all in caps because the next question will be about how comfortable you are with transparency. So take a minute to weigh in and vote. So I think it looks like the voting's done. We have a lot of people who are very comfortable with foundation transparency. That's excellent. And then a few people who still might need a little convincing. Terrific. And so let's just jump to this next one. So same scale, 7 being the most and 1 being the least. How comfortable are you personally with the idea of transparency? All right, looks like we have the results coming in. Awesome. So we have a really open-minded group of people on the call, but also a couple of people with some hesitancy around transparency. And I think that that's actually really good and really okay. And we'll talk at some point about the idea of appropriate transparency, which is the idea that not everything can or should be shared. Great. So with this litmus test in mind, what I wanted to do is just share something from a different part of the guide. One of the things that we did throughout was debunk several myths. And the reason that we sort of framed it this way is because we have a lot of preconceived notions of, oh, transparency is going to take us too much time or too much money. And the interviews that we did very directly debunked them, where we have information that, no, these things don't have to be true. So I just thought I'd share one with you to sort of get us warmed up before our conversation about communicating well. So this myth is, since my foundation annually submits to the IRS the Form 990-PF, which is available to the public, I can check transparency off of our foundation's to-do list. So here's the reality. As the guide outlines, key parts of foundation transparency are timeliness and accessibility. For those unfamiliar with U.S. regulations, the 990-PF is the tax document that private foundations must file annually that becomes a matter of public record, and for the majority of U.S. foundations is the only resource that discloses their grants activity and other key aspects of their work. But there can be a delay of 2 or more years in accessing a particular foundation's 990-PF So this regulatory document really isn't the best method to foster transparency. And as someone who formerly worked for the IRS, which is sort of my hidden background, I can vouch that it takes easily 2 or more years to share. James Canales, who's the CEO of the James Irvine Foundation, explains that the foundation goes beyond the 990 PF when it comes to sharing its executive compensation practices, because asking someone to sift through a 350-page report to find what they're looking for really isn't very transparent. I think another good way to think of this is that donors expect charities to go beyond what may be required by law to demonstrate their transparency about their work. For instance, few donors today will consider making a donation to a nonprofit organization that doesn't have a website, even though websites really aren't required by law. But the majority of private foundations do not have their own websites. In fact, only 7% do. As many donors have pointed out, it's difficult in today's digital world to trust an organization that doesn't have a web presence, and that goes for funder and grantee alike. And beyond trust, much of the transparency that donors talked about in this section was actually about increasing transparency among their own grantees to accelerate the change we were all looking to work toward in specific portfolios. A regulatory document is not going to help you accomplish that. But as a grant maker, you should want grantees to learn from one another, and serving as a catalyst for that grantee peer learning is an important role for a grant maker. And that hinges on being willing to disclose data, which goes far beyond the 990. So that's a myth that we officially debunked in the guide. So given that, I want to just give a reminder too that you can chat in questions at any time to us, but we're going to move on specifically to our entree portion of the webinar, which is chatting about communication transparency practices. And as a lead-in to that, let's talk specifically about how openly your foundation communicates. So again, on that scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being exceptionally well and 1 being poorly, how openly would you say that your foundation communicates? And you can weigh in on the poll on your screen. Give you 2 more seconds. All right, great. Ooh, this is excellent. It seems like we really have some great communicators on the call, and maybe if we have a little time at the end, we can open it up to some other folks sharing their stories. And we also have a few people that could communicate a little bit more exceptionally. In fact, nobody said that they communicate perfectly. Nobody's communicating at the exceptional level, but we have a few people who are lined up and ready to do it. So hopefully we can take this a step further by the end of the call. So in the chapter on communicating well, we had a couple of key learnings that I'll share sort of as an introduction to this. The first is that people access information in different ways, which, while it seems really intuitive, is important for us all to keep in mind. Some of it's generational differences, but a lot of it too is depending on where you like to consume information and for how long. So for instance, I like to read the Sunday New York Times always in print version, but the rest of the week I read the newspaper on public transit, so I read it digitally on my iPad. So there's sort of a difference in the when and the how with where people access information. A second key learning is that providing a variety of paths through which to communicate messages increases the reach and strength of a foundation's transparency. So if you're starting a new program, just having a press release is not sufficient because that message will only be disseminated to a certain number of people in one single way. Instead, you really have to pair that with a social media plan, with word of mouth, with personal emails, and perhaps to a couple of news articles. And a third key learning is that some mediums lend themselves to informality and a human voice, which builds trust and understanding that research reports and calls for proposal do not. So this one, most of the interviews really got at the value of keeping that human voice and being a little bit less scripted, which is ironic because we're in a webinar, which is always very scripted. So just keeping an eye on that. And with these thoughts as an introduction, I'd love to introduce our guests from the Raymond John Wean Foundation. We have three lovely co-presenters. So we have Cheryl, Lori, and we have Jennifer. And they'll share who they are when they're talking. But welcome, ladies.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Great. So I thought we could just start by having one or more of you tell us a little bit of background about your foundation for those who are less familiar.
Sure. This is Jennifer. I'd be happy to. The Raymond John Wean Foundation was established in 1949 and for a large extent was traditional in the sense that its funding priorities follow the interests and geography of family members. And I guess some decades later, with the loss of the steel industry, as well as tremendous disinvestment in this area locally and federally, the foundation leadership began to explore what other ways they could have a more meaningful impact. So in 2006, the foundation underwent a strategic planning process with PolicyLink, which is a national research institute. And from that came our blueprint, our transformation into a place-based grant maker with a focus on economically disadvantaged communities in Warren and Youngstown. Central to our work is the guiding principle that consistent resident engagement is essential to lasting change. And so here's how we show up. And financial, training, and technical assistance to nonprofit organizations in our 5 issue priorities, which are early childhood, educational opportunity, economic opportunity, community revitalization, and public and civic sector leadership. So in addition to that support, we have spurred various grassroots efforts to improve the quality of life, which includes an in-house grassroots grant-making program, a comprehensive community organizing initiative, and 2 community development corporations, again, all to improve the quality of life in the Mahoning Valley.
Terrific. That's really helpful background, and I think tees us up really nicely for diving into chatting more about transparency. So let's just start with the big hurdle question. So often the big hurdle with foundation transparency isn't really how to do it, but why it should be a priority. And we saw in the poll earlier that a lot of funders are comfortable with the idea of transparency, but then it's the question of how to prioritize it. So can you share a little bit about what motivated your foundation's commitment to increasing transparency through communication and community engagement?
Hi, this is Cheryl. The biggest hurdle in obtaining our transparency was that we were the best kept secret in town. And so when we put anything out, either in writing or on our website, people kind of didn't know who the Wean Foundation was or what we did. So when we did go out and change our priorities to be more impactful in the community, we did face some reaction from the community. Of course, the first was shock because they didn't know we existed. And then the second was from those that received grant-making dollars in the last 40 years. Were kind of fearful that their funding was going to cease because they just received it year after year after year.
Interesting. So how did you sort of alleviate those concerns? What did you do to help communicate that it would be okay and that you'd continue to be a partner, or if that wasn't the case, that you were shifting priorities?
Again, this is Cheryl. The first thing we did was to try to communicate as much as possible. And at the time of the transition, social media was not necessarily as open as it is now. and the foundation was restricted in that its website did not get started until early 2000s. But we were very careful to let the grantees know in advance that their funding would maybe be decreased or eliminated. We also notified them, I think I just said that, very early to let them know. We had open, honest, and difficult conversations for those organizations that were no longer going to fit either in our geographic limitations or in what the focus was for the foundation as the years progressed. But we also then added the workshops and seminars so that maybe we couldn't do that with financial support. However, we did want to, and excuse me, but this is what I would always say, is teach the organizations how to fish so that they could become sustainable on their own without relying on the foundation's funding in the past years.
Great. And so I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, that when you realized you were the best kept secret in town, you started putting yourselves out there in ways just beyond your website. Could you talk maybe about your Facebook page or your newsletter or some of the other places that I know that you started putting yourself out there, and how you determined a transparent strategy around those mediums?
Good morning. This is Lori, and I'll speak to that. In keeping with our desire to create windows into the foundation instead of doors that we'd had been previously, we really did begin to engage traditional forms of media, and I can speak specifically to those in just a moment. But in addition, the foundation, as Cheryl noted, really put an emphasis on the residents of our community, because they're the greatest asset that any community is going to have. And so that human factor of them being actual walking billboards for us, they're your cheapest form of marketing and communicating that you'll ever have. So we took a lot of time to work on building relationships with the residents, and in any communication it's two-way. So we also benefited in developing these relationships because they were able to bring what they were seeing and experiencing in the community into the foundation. And we did that by developing things like resident councils and emerging leaders programs that, as Cheryl spoke to, equip those leaders. In addition, in May of 2012, we moved into a new facility renovated here on the Courthouse Square in Warren. And one of the central pieces of our new building is what we refer to as our community level, which is the street level access of our 3-level building. And within the building, we have several conference areas that we open those up to the area nonprofit and civic organizations so that they have a meeting place. And again, we're bringing them into the foundation, I think, which speaks to another level of transparency. But when you ask specifically about what we've done as far as the traditional forms of medium, we did develop a website. We launched that actually last summer, a revision, I should say. And on that website, we do have press releases. We have our newsletters on there. We have news coverage, anything that's covered. And that's a great way of not only us, the press releases let us tell our story, but the news coverage lets others see the interpretation that folks outside of the foundation have of us. And it's a great way, again, to just really promote that two-way conversation. Interestingly enough, we have dabbled into Facebook, and we've dabbled into what we'll share in a little bit about a resource portal that we developed on our website. We also use an online service, Constant Contact. I'm sure many of you are aware of that, but we use that as a tool also to share our events. We share public service announcements for our partners and other things going on in the community. So we've tried to incorporate those forms of media to be able to layer our message and hopefully not only get our message out there, but again, get feedback from the community.
Terrific. Well, I love the multifaceted approach that you all have taken and really involving that human element as well as more traditional forms of sharing by communicating online and with press releases. I think is a really wonderful, well-rounded approach that seems to be working well for you. Let's go into a little bit more about that community resource portal that you mentioned. I'm curious how pieces like that help both your foundation and your grantees to do work more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that as an employee here at the foundation I really value is the foundation stance on they're willing to take a risk. So when it came to the community resource portal, again, so we are gathering information from all of our resident organizations, but they're not necessarily speaking to one another, and they have great assets and opportunities for one another to become engaged and to collaborate. And so we endeavored to develop a community resource portal on our website, and within that portal, organizations are able to submit their name and their contact information and the resources they have available. And then it's also a searchable database so that if another group is looking for who has gardening tools, then they can go onto the website, they can search for that and find out, hey, such and such organization, Youngstown has those, let me give them a call. So the idea was to network our groups as well, and the second part of that resource portal then is engagement opportunities. As we spoke before about equipping our leaders, many times we do trainings and we have our emerging leaders program. We get them to a certain level, and then we need to plug them in. So the engagement opportunities portion of the community resource portal allows organizations to post board openings, internships, and different ways and opportunities they have for folks to get involved. And then on the flip side, those who we have trained can go into that resource and find out what opportunities are available to them.
And do you ever have trouble with keeping that up to date? I find personally that when we at Foundation Center have all of these portals and resources that involve sort of human input, that it's sustainable for a little while, but then sometimes that'll taper off. How do you deal with that challenge of transparency, of staying current?
Well, to be transparent with all of you, we actually launched the community portal last fall, and we launched it in a static version on the website. And it really was beneficial to do that. And we found and we're finding that working in phases is very, very beneficial because having it static on the website let us utilize it and, for lack of a better word, play with a little bit to see what its strengths and weaknesses were. And then we moved into the phase of developing it to be a searchable live database. And really, we have just gotten to the place where we're comfortable with the format and all of the execution that's on the website. And so in the next couple weeks, we're going to be launching into populating that database by reaching out to the organizations. So I honestly can't speak to that completely because we haven't quite gotten to that point. But I think that you're right. The challenge is not always getting something launched, but it's sustaining it.
Great, but your point about working in phases is spot on. I think any efforts to be more transparent, you can't just go from point 0 to that point 7 on that pole scale. You really have to be iterative about it. So that's really great insight. We actually have a question from someone on the line, just a small detail. They're curious what what software you use to run the community resource portal. So what it's built on or how it's managed.
Okay, this is Lori again, and I'll speak to that. We actually have a vendor who does our website development. I do know that the website is a WordPress background, but that was a custom build that they did for us. So we went to them with a template and something that we had seen elsewhere and said we'd like something like this built for our website.
Great. And in a lot of the folks that we interviewed, most people identified WordPress as being more than sufficient to meet most needs. If you're going to be building a huge, robust website, like our GrantCraft website, for instance, is a little bit more robust maybe, and we had that custom built using Expression Engine. There's also other ones like Easy Publish, and then free options like Drupal. And the difference is sort of the more you pay, the more ability you have to tinker with the end product. So for anyone looking at how you might want to build a similar software platform, we actually have a resource through GrantCraft called the Interactive Tool Finder, and you can find it on the collaboration part of the GrantCraft website, and we have a list of different content management systems on that. So back to some of the challenges with transparency, I wanted to ask you a bit about the fear that there might be risk involved, particularly for smaller family foundations. There's often a big sense of privacy around the foundation activities. So I'm curious, and you alluded to this a little bit before, but did you experience any pushback or resistance from donors or staff or your board or the public? And if so, what did you sort of do to diminish that sense of risk around privacy?
Sure. So it's Jennifer, and I'll say I joined the foundation in '06. And from where I sit, then and even 7 years later, the foundation was very intentional, specifically regarding inclusion and board diversity. So when we look at age and experience and gender, it seems to me, I've been in other organizations or within staff and volunteer, that there sometimes takes on this stance of us versus them. So, the less experienced and the more mature members or what have you, and that doesn't exist. I feel like on so many levels our board connects or intersects, if you will, that when it comes to our issue priorities, our community involvement, or our presence, we really just come together in that way. I think Cheryl may be able to speak more to what it may have looked like historically.
Historically, it was 4 administrators on the board, and then it grew to adding community members in 1998 they started adding community members. They increased from 4 to, I believe now our bylaws do allow for up to 11 board members, and it's very deliberate that they are from the community and that they do represent a cross-section of the Mahoning Valley, so we don't have 10 of them representing Trumbull County and only 1 representing Mahoning, so the equality within the representation is extremely important. And they look for that in their staff too. So it's just a teamwork. It's board employer-employee relationship is a partnership and not just you have your set. So that's very important in the transparency, which we do reflect that also with our grantees. So we don't have just the grantee grantor. We hope that if they're having a problem with the program, they can contact us, and that we do have more of a relationship, and we do collaborate and network with them, as has been previously said by Lori.
That's a terrific point that you make yourself very easily accessible, so it is more of a relationship. And I'm curious if you have any advice for the folks on this webinar of what you did to overcome the power dynamic that we have at foundations, where usually we're not seen as approachable in a very human way. It's sort of more from a funding standpoint that we're approachable. So how did you take that power dynamic and transform it into something that could be more relationship-based? Was there something specific you could give as advice to folks who are listening?
This is Cheryl. Just as an overall general, I do believe that the board was very, very persuasive in wanting to be community-oriented and to be accessible. Again, I might be telling a story, but from 1998 to the present, we went from the greatest kept secret to the Friendly Foundation so that people can access us. And they're not afraid to approach our board members either. Our board members are open, and when they can answer questions, they will, and when they need to transfer it where it's staff's responsibility, they do that. So I think that with the board being the push and wanting to be accessible, we want to be impactful not only with dollars, technical assistance, but also with the staff and the knowledge that the foundation board and staff can present.
That's great. So on your website, you share links to press coverage and the newsletter that we showed on the screen before. I'll put that up now. So how does telling your story in the public eye and creating those public relationships help the work of the foundation? So specifically, how does telling your story make a difference, and whose story is it important to tell, yours or your grantees?
So it's Jennifer. Hi.
Hi.
I think that for us, it's more important to tell the story of our grantees. In fact, there have been multiple conversations when we've had third-party consultants come in and help with our marketing plan and how to tell our story. We had to be almost encouraged or pushed even to tell the story of the foundation, because we've always said, our work is behind the scenes. We don't need to be in the paper. It doesn't need to highlight us. We want to highlight our grantees, and I think we've come to a point now that we know it's a combination, because having us as a part of that story helps those grantees to be able to communicate and articulate what they do, leverage resources with other funders, help them work with, amongst themselves. I think by being more open and engaging also sets the stage or serves as a model of how it's done. So we, do more than talk the talk, but talk the talk.
Terrific. And just a question on the specific benefits. Is there anything that you've specifically noticed that's changed about your work from increased levels of transparency? So I kind of want to ask this in two parts. First is sort of the short term, any impact that you've seen, really, you made a change to communicate more openly, have more public relationships, tell the stories of your grantees. What happened from that? And then sort of the second part of it would be more broadly how maybe the ethos of the foundation has changed in the long haul.
Yeah, I think so. Again, with being more open and engaging, we increase knowledge on our part. We learn about other funders doing similar work or work that's aligned and sometimes completely different, but how we can work together. We eliminate the misperceptions and misinformation, as Cheryl had noted earlier, with those difficult conversations. Folks around town, Wean doesn't fund this anymore. Well, here's what we do fund. And I think folks who do work in these areas are able to find their space within the foundation. We leverage resources. Our funding, I believe last year was about 2.3 with training and financial and technical support, $2.3 million. It's not a lot of money for a valley such as the Valley. But when we're able to leverage what we bring to the table with community resources, physical resources, in-kind, all of that comes together to really promote what the Valley has to offer. We share our knowledge, so the things that we learn, best practices, how to do things differently, who we're bringing to the table. I call it, the cover your paper phenomena, where we found a resource and so we don't want to share it, and it's quite the opposite for us. The more resources that we can bring to the Valley to leverage what we offer helps all around. And I think it fosters credibility and trust by some of the examples that we've shared, our board membership, the resident council involvement, the convenings, the grant seeker orientations, the grantee orientations. Our residents really feel a part of the conversation.
That's terrific. And the other day when we were talking, I just want to highlight a phrase that you used then that really stuck with me. You said it really made our work feel more genuine, not just to us, but to everyone that we're working with. And I think sort of that act of being transparent, which can lead to greater sincerity and being more genuine, being perceived as more genuine, can only help with work. So that's terrific.
No, I agree.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and then I just want to remind folks, please chat in your questions. We will have a little bit of time for questions, and much more interesting to have your questions than mine. But I will ask you guys this final question for now. So one of the things that became clear as we conducted the research for the guide is that transparency is really a mindset for a funder and an evolutionary process rather than an endpoint. In fact, no foundation who was interviewed said that they're perfectly transparent. So I'm curious, what's on the horizon for you as far as next steps on the road to greater foundation transparency?
Okay, this is Jennifer. I believe this begins with our board. We have an extremely strong board. I am at the front of the line of saying that we have the best board in the Valley, and they really provide direction and a vision for our staff. And they give us the tools and the space to do, we're the folks that are closest to what's going on in the community, and they give us the space to do what we do. I think our community portal is an example of that. Research was conducted, and as a result, we discovered a gap, and we filled it. And we do that on many avenues. We research it, we bring the right people to the table, and then we work to get it in place. Another example is we have, over the years, as many foundations do, commissioned or supported or financed many scan assessments and the like. And what we were finding was that we weren't using that information in a strategic way. It was in a vacuum or in a silo for that particular work. And so we went, as I call it, old school, because I can be considered young, but I'm really old at heart. So I developed these binders with staff support of some of these documents so we could be more strategic, but also that we could share them with our grantees and grant seekers who were doing work in our area to better align the work. Well, we had this third-party consultant in, and we were sharing the work with her. And I said, again, old school, let us know what you want copies of, and we'll send it. She's like, no, don't worry about it. I'll just pull it from your website. And we're like, oh, yeah, about that. So, like right now, Lori is working with our web designer to house a space on our website so that we can make that information more readily accessible, transparent for our grant seekers and our grantee and really the general public. And then as a result of our planning for this call and reading the guide, I started to rethink this whole internal-external document. So I'm also adding that as an agenda item for our September board meeting so that we can include our board as a part of this, I think, very thought-provoking conversation.
Terrific. That is really great feedback to hear, especially from reading the guide. And I'm curious, actually, just as a quick follow-up to that, I mentioned earlier the phrase appropriate transparency, and so that's really a lead-in to your conversation about the internal versus the external documents and what should be kept where. Do any of the three of you have thoughts on sort of where you would draw the line on what you'd like to share publicly and what you'd like to keep internal? And I'm totally putting you on the spot there, but I'm curious.
Well, it's interesting because what we have, like for instance internally, assessments of a local school district. In the wrong hands, and I'm using air quotes here, you just don't know what that could look like if we were to. So of course we would want to include some of our key partners in that conversation along with our board. And I also understand that this whole piece of transparency is a continuum. So not only is it done in phases, there are different levels. So while something as sensitive as that document might not make it to the website for general public consumption, that doesn't mean that somewhere along that continuum, first, we've already had the difficult conversations with the school board surrounding that report, right? But then there are also other groups who support and are there as I'll just say support to the school districts, that information, they should be privy to that information as well. So maybe not the website, but there are other avenues along the continuum that we could consider.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to checking back in with you as time goes on to where you all end up and how you keep refining thoughts on that. It'll be really interesting. So we have a question of how do you guys communicate the impact and results of your investments? Do you use any tools? Do you mostly tell stories? How do you communicate it?
This is Lori. I would say that we do that in several ways. When we go back to the human factor, with our Neighborhood Success and Leadership Program, the team has been very thoughtful in bringing those grantees back together for what they call convening so that they can share with one another their wins with their projects. So we try to highlight the projects that way. And then with social media, really on the website, when we make our quarterly grants, we do a grantee highlight of those organizations and of their projects and links to their websites. We also do a press release after every board meeting, letting the community know who the dollars have gone to and finance has gone to. And then we have, on our website in particular, we have sliders at the top, and I'm sure you're all familiar with those. And what we try to do is when we see some good coverage that's come through or things we're made aware of, we'll highlight our grantees at that point too. So, I think the key with communication is layering, and so anytime that we have the opportunity to layer the wins of our grantees, we try to take that and capitalize on it.
Terrific. And maybe related, maybe not. What do you think about using scorecards as a transparency tool?
Well, this is Lori, and I will speak to it from the frame of reference that I have. So in a past life in another organization, I think scorecards can be very, very helpful as a visual. It gives you a snapshot very quickly. The thing I would probably be a little hesitant in is there's always a story behind a chart or a visual. And so I think it's really important that if you're going to use scorecards, you also have that narrative to go along with it, because I think there's some shortcomings in just a scorecard.
Great, thanks. So I don't see any other questions getting chatted in right now, but I'm not going to say goodbye and thank you yet because we still have a few more things we can share. So I'll keep you guys on the line, but maybe you can just hit mute for a short while I share a few action steps with folks, and then we'll bring you back for sort of a closing thought and to answer any last questions. Sound good? Good. You must be on mute already. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to just share a couple of action steps that we came up with in the guide for how folks can communicate well by being more transparent. So the first is sort of the obvious, but maybe not so obvious, which is to build an engaging website. For anyone who's having trouble convincing their board that having a website is important, I hope you can use the guide as a tool, because every person that we interviewed in the surveys all pointed to this being the first point of contact. And we actually have at the Foundation Center a wonderful service called Web Builder, where we'll support the building of a brand new website for free. So I can put you in touch with Danielle, who's in charge of that program, if you shoot me an email at the end. The next step is to encourage staff to actively tweet and blog to communicate their work with minimal restrictions. And so one of the examples that we profile in the guide is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where more than 75% of their employees tweet using their own Twitter handle, most of them on the program team. And personally, when I worked for a foundation before this, I actually found it to be one of the most effective tools for having more honest conversations with grantees, because they were excited that I was following their work and would sort of retweet something or ask them a simple question online, and we were able to have less of the funder-grantee dynamic and more of the community member relationship-based dynamic that we were talking about before. The next thing is to integrate multimedia like videos and infographics into static reports. There have been a lot of writings lately about how nobody's reading long reports anymore. And so to the extent possible, presenting bite-sized, engaging information is a way to do better messaging. And on the new GrantCraft website, we actually have something that we're calling takeaways, which are bite-sized snippets of longer guides so that you don't have to read the whole thing, because increasingly we're finding people are not doing that. So takeaways are sort of an easy way to search for that bite-sized information, and many of them are in the form of video or infographics. Next is to find one internal document that's useful to an outside audience and publish it. So this is the idea of taking internal documents and making them public because, hey, why not? And we heard a couple of instances where something that was useful internally was shared, perhaps like a program assessment was shared with peer funders who were able to leverage that and not reinvent the wheel, and then also for grantees to sort of know the frameworks that funders are working from. And then a final action step that I would encourage you to take that we sort of would just encourage from this chapter is if you're tweeting, to tweet us at GrantCraft in Glass Pockets, not only so that we can follow you, but because we actually keep lists of foundation staff who are tweeting. That's a GrantCraft list, and Glass Pockets keeps a list of funders who are tweeting. And we share those lists and actually have a lot of subscribers. So that's a great way to participate in a more global conversation about philanthropy with peer organizations and peer funders. We had a question that might be relevant here, which is if you're a corporate foundation, do you need a website separate from the corporation? If so, why? And while I'm not a legal expert, I'm pretty confident that no, you do not need a website that's separate from the corporation, but you do need to be careful about how the expenses are recorded. So again, I'm not providing any legal advice, but you should probably talk with someone just about where the expenses get covered, but it can absolutely be the same website, and in fact it might be higher trafficked, and you might be able to sort of build on the brand in that way. So I hope that answers the question to the extent that I'm able to answer it. What I thought I'd do is just give everyone a 3-minute background about Glass Pockets and then about GrantCraft so that you know about these resources, because they can help you to be more transparent, and both are completely free to use, so we're not selling you anything. So first, with Glass Pockets. Glass Pockets is a Foundation Center initiative and website that was launched in 2010, and as I shared earlier, it was designed solely for the purpose to champion greater philanthropic transparency. So what you're seeing here on the screen is actually a free self-assessment tool that I hope you'll all use to help you assess your foundation's online transparency practices. The assessment form looks at 23 transparency and accountability indicators and also inventories communication channels. Though the majority of foundations that have currently taken and shared the assessment are U.S.-based, we also welcome global participation. So even though that's not so relevant on this call, just wanted you to know it's not just for U.S. foundations. The indicators we selected were based on an inventory of foundation websites to see what current online transparency practices are like. We also relied heavily on the definition of accountability provided by one of our Glass Pockets partners, the UK-based One World Trust, which defines accountability as being made of 4 elements, and those elements are transparency, evaluation, complaint and response mechanisms, and participation. We use these elements to create our indicators list, which shapes the submission form foundations complete to participate in the self-assessment. Once a foundation takes the assessment, we invite them to share it publicly, of course, on Glass Pockets. Some people consider it a scorecard, to the question about scorecards earlier, though we deliberately steered clear of that term. So we don't add up the check marks to give a score because we don't want that to be a barrier to participation. The other thing, again, is that not all forms of transparency are appropriate for every foundation. So that's not to say that more is better. The goal here is to give foundations a reason to make transparency a priority, to feel less intimidated to share certain data when they see their peers are already making it available, and then to not hold back from participating until they attain a certain score. In essence, we're meeting foundations where they are, so no one needs to feel excluded. So as a first step in creating a culture of transparency at foundations, we suggest our users begin by using this free transparency assessment tool to structure a conversation inside their foundations so that you can deliberately think through what level of transparency makes sense for you. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So that's Glass Pockets. And then we come over to GrantCraft, which again is having an exciting day today because of the launch. So I would actually ask that if you guys enjoyed this webinar or are curious about other GrantCraft resources, definitely tweet and help get the word out. GrantCraft is a service of the Foundation Center that taps the practical wisdom of funders to develop resources that improve the practice of philanthropy. And even though you see funders in sort of that core mission statement, we actually have more nonprofits who join our site, interestingly, and that's because they want to know what funders are thinking. And so it's actually a really neat platform where that barrier between the grant seekers and the grant makers can come together in a shared collection of stories. Something that excites me about the current site is that you have the opportunity to share your wisdom. So previously you could read and download guides on the website, but it didn't invite user submissions. So if you wanted to share a guest blog post or contribute a case study, it was a little bit harder because you had to be directly in touch with our team here at GrantCraft. And now it's much easier, and we hope that that will help us to curate a more global and dynamic collection of stories in many different forms. I'll show you one more slide about GrantCraft. The new website actually takes into account a bunch of different content types, and this connects directly to the theme of communicating using many different mediums because people consume information differently. So what you see on the screen are just some examples of the 13 content types that we offer. And overall, the design is a little bit more intuitive and aesthetically pleasing and readable on and off screen. So I hope that you'll join us on the GrantCraft website. So, oh great, we got a fun question for me about sharing your wisdom and how we manage inappropriate posts. So the way that the form is set up is it's completely moderated, so nothing goes directly onto the site. Anything that seems like spam or just someone, like I got one the other day who's someone submitting a proposal, I just ignore that because we have a very clear, we're not a grant maker and that's not one of the forms of content. If it's something that's workable, I will email someone and say, hey, this needs a little bit of work. Let's work on it together to get it posted. And then there are others, like someone sent a video of a really great talk by Kirsten Lodel, who's the executive director of LIFT, which is a national anti-poverty nonprofit. He just sent a link to a video, and from that we were able to craft a blog post around that video to share it. So it's a little bit ad hoc right now until we figure out what the flow of submissions versus posts are, but I still maintain that it's really important for us to curate carefully and make sure that everything that goes on the site is valuable for other users. So before I close out, I want to first take a little poll to see now how comfortable we are with the idea of transparency. So I'll let everyone weigh in on that. Again, 7 is the most and 1 being the least. How comfortable are you now after listening to our lovely presenters and hearing a bit more on the topic? The votes are coming in. All right. Cool. Well, I'm excited to announce that we've seen an upward shift in being more comfortable with the idea of transparency, which to me makes this very successful. So I'm very grateful that we had some great stories to share with you all. And I wanted to turn it over to Cheryl, Lori, and Jennifer to see if they had any closing thoughts or closing advice to leave you with.
I would just add simply, it's Jennifer, I would add simply, while less traditional, really the human factor, as we noted, our residents, the communication as a strategy is highly effective. They really appreciate, the residents appreciate the access to the foundation, and staff appreciate their network's access as well. So it really is a two-way street, and we found that our work isn't nearly as impactful without the support and buy-in of our residents.
Great. Anyone else? Cheryl, Lori, other closing thoughts?
This is Lori, and I might just add that, the website and the communication platforms, for the most part, are my responsibility. And one thing that I have learned since that's happened is that there's a great value in not trying to take on too much all at one time. In fact, we are really at the place where we have a lot of really nice tools in our toolbox, but what we've found out is that we don't necessarily have a clear blueprint of how we want to use those tools or what we want to build with them. So we've actually kind of hit the pause button to take a step back and reassess the things that we have and how we want to move forward. If you would go to our newsletter section of our website, you'll see there's no newsletters on there yet for 2014. And I think it's a great example and speaks to the leadership here that when we went to do our first quarterly newsletter, we found out that we were reporting a lot of things that we had already communicated, and the timeliness was not where we wanted it to be. And so we just decided to put it on hold and reassess. And so don't be afraid to take those pauses because, as you said, you'll never arrive. It's a never-ending activity, and I think you have to always take your capacity into consideration as well. So find out what's really most important to your organization and make that be the theme of everything that you do, and do it well.
Great advice.
So this is Cheryl with thoughts on the overall, say, the administrative side of the stages of transparency. It should be both internal and external. It does require a lot of board support. The staff really needs to be educated on what the transparency is and how to relate that. We have to be ready for honest discussion with residents, not just talking down, but to have discussions. And to remember that it is a journey with learning hurdles, both giving and taking from each side of the road.
Excellent note to end on. Well, this was really terrific. I really enjoyed chatting with you all, and thanks again to Philanthropy Ohio for hosting, and thanks to everyone for attending. I hope you found value in this, and certainly shoot me an email or Jennifer an email with any lingering thoughts, ideas, comments, questions that you have. I invite you all as attendees of this webinar too, if you have further thoughts on transparency, to share a guest blog post on GrantCraft about the idea of transparency in your foundation. So if you're interested in that, follow up with me as well. So with that, Tiffany, is there anything else on your end, or shall we close the webinar?
That's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.